Good morning and welcome to the 12th meeting of the Equalities and Human Rights Committee. I thank all members and witnesses for their attendance today and Broadcasting Office for their work in setting up this remote formal meeting of the committee. Our main item of business this morning is our fourth evidence session on how COVID-19 has impacted on equalities and human rights. Responses to our ongoing calls for views are on our website. I welcome our witnesses today from the Scottish Government: Tina McKelvey, Minister for Older People and Equalities, Sean Stronach, Equality Unit Head, and Elizabeth Campbell, Human Rights Strategic Lead. Minister, can I invite you to make a brief opening statement, after which we'll move to questions. Minister.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak today to your committee. As we all know, the current health crisis is the biggest I think we've ever faced, and the Scottish Government's absolute priority, and I suppose everybody's priority, is to save lives. However, we are well aware that this pandemic and the restrictions currently in place cause harms of their own, something we're very acutely aware of. That's why recognising the impact on people's everyday lives is so important, especially in relation to their rights and freedoms. The Scottish Government is committed to ensuring that human rights, children's rights and equality are embedded in everything that we do, and must be central to all of our response to the coronavirus outbreak. Our framework for decision making set out 7 core principles across our work, including fair and ethical. We are committed to continuing to uphold the principles of human dignity, autonomy, respect and equality as we deal with the pandemic and obviously its inevitable consequences. Crucially, the framework for decision making also makes clear that harms caused by coronavirus do not impact everybody equally, and the Scottish Government is ensuring that our response to the pandemic limits these unequal impacts. We have acted to provide support to those groups and communities that need it most via our £350 million Community Support Fund, and we have also sought to address the unequal impacts of COVID-19 by ensuring our actions meet the needs of all of Scotland's people. And I've got a few examples here to just emphasise that. We are paying for minority ethnic older people to receive hot meals and support Age Scotland's national telephone helpline with around £700,000 for significant expansion and upgrading. We are translating public health information into British Sign Language and ensuring interpreters are there for key briefings, as you'll know. We are funding Young Scot to help provide information and social media support to young people. We are providing specific advice and funding for Gypsy traveller communities to ensure that their needs are met during the emergency, including specific funding for essential sanitation facilities for Gypsy traveller families, enabling them to follow government advice and curb the spread of the virus. And we have provided an additional £1.35 million to Scottish Women's Aid to support service redesign, expand the national helpline capacity and provide support for vulnerable women and children. We've also worked across a range of legislative and policy areas, from ensuring that ethical guidance in clinical settings upholds both the right to life and non-discrimination, to embedding civil and political rights through the development of policy around restrictions on movement, gatherings and policing. And we continue to be open and transparent with the Parliament about how we are working to ensure that COVID response is fully compliant with human rights and children's rights obligations and embeds equality. I wrote to you this week in the committee, hopefully you've all had a chance to see that letter, and in response to the convener's questions on a number of issues relating to the equality and human rights impacts of the Scottish Government's COVID-19 response. I really look forward to discussing these crucial issues with you further today, and I'm looking forward to your questions and the discourse we'll have this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. If I could start off, I'd like to talk to you about inclusive communication this morning. Firstly, to ask whether the Scottish Government has data on the number of people with communication needs in Scotland. In your letter to the committee, you mentioned the communication hub. Can I ask how long that's been operating for and how long the Scottish Government has had guidance on inclusive communication, please?
Well, you'll know that one of the key issues that we've had along the way with COVID-19 is the amount of disaggregated data that we have. There's a big piece of work being done across the whole of government in order to focus in on that data, work out what we need, how we need it. The impact on BAME people is a perfect example of thinking we've had all the right data when really maybe we haven't. So we've got a bit of work to do there on data. We'll be working across with members, many of our organisations, including DPOs, GDA, for example, are all doing surveys so that we can completely understand the picture out there, because I suspect many people who give us information on the situation with communication issues will maybe, we don't hit everybody there. So some of the organisations are doing some of that work. So many of them are doing surveys every week. So we'll have hopefully an update on data and much more accurate data. And there's a big piece of work being done, as I say, across government to look at that. The sort of actions we've taken, because I think inclusive communications and ensuring that people get the right information in the format that they need is incredibly important, especially when you're putting forward, in some cases, complex but incredibly important public health messages. So in relation to British Sign Language users, for instance, the Scottish Government arranged for in situ BSL and English interpreters to cover the daily press conferences, because that seemed to be the place where everybody was going for their information. We've produced Easy Read. We've worked with the Commission on Learning Disability, Disability Equality Scotland, to produce BSL, Easy Read. Similarly with NHS Inform to produce Easy Read and BSL versions of the COVID-19 advice. We've also published an Easy Read version of the Framework for Decision Making. We've published alternative formats of the route map, Easy Read BSL translation and audio. Again, the phase 1 and phase 2, the same formats. And across a number of languages as well, including working with Deafblind Scotland to provide Braille, Moon and XXL print and audio versions as well. The Communications Hub has been something that's incredibly important, because I know that the convener herself and myself for a number of years have always supported having that right information, and you'll know that a big part of the issue is about people having digital exclusion and how that's been an issue if many of the formats are online. So that's why we've attempted, I think we now produce all of our documents over about 16 different formats to ensure that information gets out there. And digital exclusion was a big issue there. We ran a few pilots with GDA on digital exclusion, providing devices, but not just devices, but access to data, which was a big issue for many people. And when I tuned into their conference last week, they had initially about 40% of their members who were digitally competent to tune into a conference. Last week it was 80-odd%. So just in those few weeks and that interaction, you could see the difference that makes. But you may ask specifically about the Communication Hub, and that's been running since 2016, and that work, we develop that all the time. And I think this pandemic again has given us a look at how do we do more work within the Communication Hub to make sure that people do get access to the communications they need in the format that suits them best, and in a way that helps them understand, especially when it's important messages like a public health informational message.
Thank you. Certainly we heard that the broadly the simple messaging from the Scottish Government was good, and certainly that the daily briefings from the First Minister and the Health Secretary were very helpful. However, we also heard communication is not just about giving people information, it's about allowing them to respond and interact. Inclusion Scotland told us that the SMS response on the shielding letter was helpful for some, but not for others. They also said that when some of the guidance came out, it was only in written English, and that they had to go to the Scottish Government to say that the Easy Read version should be put out at the same time. So it feels like good things are happening, but not consistently. Minister Age Scotland also told us that they had to, and this is a quote, decipher and translate information from the National Health Service and the Scottish Government. I suppose the reason why I ask about how long inclusive communication standards have been in guidance and how long the hub's been operating for is, if it's not happening consistently and all the time, we maybe need to do more. We maybe need more than guidance. We heard from the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists, from Kim Hartley-Keane, that, and you've said yourself this morning that it's really fundamental in a public health effort that people understand the issues and the risks to them, and from our perspective, that they can access their rights and the support that they're entitled to and that they need. So I wonder, would you? We've seen where having inclusive communication embedded in legislation works very well with the Social Security Scotland agency. So it's embedded there in legislation and right from the beginning, and by all accounts they are getting it right. I wonder if you would support the view that inclusive communication should be seen as a public health priority. Minister.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I think it's a very fair point, actually. And in the initial first few days and weeks of the pandemic, I suppose attempting to get a big, massive public message out there as quickly as possible was what was foremost in most people's minds. You could see why that would happen. It became a health emergency, so you could see why getting to the bulk of the population quickly and hopefully that information disseminating through to others is a fair characterisation of how things were done at the very beginning. I think since that point, working with Inclusion Scotland, I've had many stakeholder meetings. Most of my time has been taken up over the last 3 months, engaging with stakeholders to find out, what are the issues, where are the issues, how can we remedy that, how can we work together, where do you need us to intervene? So my team in the Equality Unit and the Human Rights team have been working right across the whole of government to give, other departments who are maybe don't have that, first response. The first response is a clinical or a medical response. If we look at health, for instance, and advising them, understanding, producing EQIAs, giving the best outcomes, sharing best practice. And I suppose a lot of the work that we've done with the stakeholders over the past 3 months has been to say, how has that worked? Is it working? Can we do better? Tell us how. And a real, a real brilliant relationship that's built up there between all of our stakeholders, government, local government, because a big part of this is working with COSLA and working with charities and local organisations as well, so that the information gets as close to the individual as possible. You'll know we had the national helpline, we've had the national leaflet drop, we've tried to cover every single base here. It's been a massive undertaking. Yes, we never get everything right at the beginning, but all of us will understand that there's reasons behind that, but we have learned a hell of a lot since we've moved along. And yes, what I said in my opening remarks there about the communications hub is there's a bit of work I think that we need to do across other parts of government, so that when we do have an emergency like this, that we do have that easy read, Braille, BSL, all of those versions ready as they go. But I think it was quite tough at the beginning to do that, but we've managed to catch up and keep doing that now. We've got the route map, the work on the route map. We'll have an EQIA and there's an easy read version of the route map out as well. So hopefully we've got the timing right on that. But I heard the same issues that you heard at committee, and we listened to them, and hopefully we've worked with those organisations to remedy that.
Okay, thank you very much, Minister. Can I now go to Maurice Golden for his questions? Maurice.
Thank you, Convener. Minister, while accepting the emergency situation we are in, how has the Scottish Government been undertaking impact assessments on all COVID-19 related policies?
Minister.
Yeah, I guess you'll understand that doing things quickly and swiftly and as effectively as possible is always a tough thing to do. If we do that with human rights and equalities at the centre of that, then we don't build in some of the challenges that we had at the beginning. We start to take those barriers away as well. So we've been absolutely committed to carrying out equality impact assessments in relation to everything that we do in COVID-19. And as you can imagine how quick moving that is, and how detailed and the type of work that needs to be done across the whole of government to do that. So we designed the work that we are doing to ensure that policies to respond to COVID-19 work for everyone in a way that is founded in fairness and dignity, and ensures that equality and human rights are safeguarded as well. The Scottish Government and the EHRC guidance made clear that EQIAs should be commenced as soon as possible, and we did that. Impact assessments, as we know, are critical importance in tackling inequality. And the assessment of equality, human rights and children's rights impacts of coronavirus emergency legislation is a central aspect of our reporting approach. So every 3 weeks when you get those reportings, there is an equality impact assessment and human rights impact assessment done on that. That includes signposting of and to information disaggregated by protected characteristic where possible. And this is one aspect of further work that we're developing now on our approach to future reports. Consideration for human rights are and continue to be embedded in policy development for coronavirus emergency legislation. My human rights team will verify this. I've been working very, very closely with that bill team, both on the number 1 bill and the number 2 bill, with a clear analysis and understanding from our partners like the Scottish Human Rights Commission and the Equality Human Rights Commission. And we've published all of that, I think, as part of the policy memorandums for the first and the second bill, as I said. EQIAs for the first and second coronavirus bills were published on the 31st of March and the 11th of May, respectively, and they're both available via a PDF on the Scottish Government website.
Maurice.
I thank the Minister for that answer. It's understood that the public sector equality duty review is delayed. Can the Minister provide the committee with an update on that, please?
Yeah. Yes, I don't know if the last time I spoke to committee I talked about the fact that we were increasing the capacity within our equalities team to set up a standalone mainstreaming team. That's been headed up by Jenny Kemp, who many of you will know from the voluntary sector. They were working very, very closely across the whole of government on mainstreaming of equalities and human rights, and that was to underpin some of the work on where we go next with public sector equality duty. Obviously, because of COVID, that work on the public sector equality duty part of it was halted. In respect of the fact that the capacity within government was difficult to do that because of all the other EQIA work they were having to do on emergency legislation and other pieces of policy, but also because of the capacity within organisations who, embarking on a big piece of work like that whilst just trying to deal with the front line of supporting people during the pandemic. It was incredibly difficult for them as well. You'll know that the announced piece of work last week by Aileen Campbell and Gillian Somerville on social renewal, a big factor in that will be equality and human rights duties, or where we can do some more work on that. But I'm basically confirming that we're not proceeding with that work right now. Although the other piece of work that's happening in government as well is the Human Rights Task Force, and there's a section in that is all about equality duties as well. So it's not like the work's completely halted because it's being done through social renewal and through the equality, the Human Rights Task Force. But obviously, as a means to try and tackle, all of the EQIA work that needed done across the whole of government, including working very closely with our health colleagues, meant that team were focused on doing that for this period of time.
Maurice, are you content? Do you have?
Yes, thanks.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on to Deputy Convener Alex Cole-Hamilton, please. Alex.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister. It's nice to see you. I'd like to ask about a couple of things. Firstly, testing. We know that the test is actually quite a traumatic experience, so that's why carers are very keen to help administer the test with the people they're caring for, just to minimise that trauma. However, we've had anecdotal feedback to say that, particularly in the drive-through testing facilities or the home test kits, that the guidance isn't actually as clear as it might be in terms to the administration of that test to get an effective result. Given that testing is absolutely core to us getting out of the situation and controlling the virus, is the government looking at mitigating that or changing the guidance to make it a bit more user-friendly, particularly for those carers who are trying to administer it to people who are suffering?
Minister.
Okay. No, it's an incredibly important question. Alex Cole-Hamilton and other members of the committee will know that my background is in social care and social work before I came in to the Parliament. And what crossed my mind was when I seen how invasive that test was, is how would you manage to do that with someone who's got dementia or, an adult with a learning disability or other, if you've got, someone from the MND who's got a already diminished swallowing capacity. I kept thinking, how could you do the mechanics of that? Because it's an incredibly horrible test to have done. So no, it's a perfectly legitimate point, and one that I hope that we're remedying now with a bit of work that's going on. There is support available via health hubs and community health teams and a number of other areas like that. So if you're a carer and you get home kit and you're not confident at doing it, or you're a bit, I think it would be quite scary actually if you're not medically trained to do a test like that. So there is a number of support mechanisms there to do that. But if the guidance on home testing, as Alec Cole-Hamilton said, is not maybe as easy read or as understandable as possible, it's certainly something I can take back to the test team and ask them to look at that again. And this is some of the things that are emerging as we move along, especially now as we move out of lockdown and things become a bit more specified, or specifically around about individuals who continually need to shield. So I'm happy to go back to the test team to look at that guidance and see what else we can do for that, and come back to the committee on that. But I think it's a very, very fair point. But I couldn't imagine having to, if I was in a social care setting, having to test somebody like that and not feel confident to do it. So we need to make sure that people are confident, so that people get the tests when they need them and in the quickest response back as well.
Thank you. Alec.
Thank you. I'd like to move on to a wider issue affecting particularly older people, and then if convener, I could be permitted to come back in to ask about mental health issues. At the start of the pandemic, there was a lot of widespread news coverage of doctors going into care homes and asking, or rather imposing in some cases, do not resuscitate orders for either residents to sign or their family members to sign. At the time, obviously, the reasoning for that was given was about capacity in the NHS, and that if the intensivist areas of the primary care were overwhelmed, then they couldn't take patients who were near end of life anyway. Can I ask what we've learned from that, what the government has learned from that, whether whether the minister believes that was actually a breach of human rights, and what we can do to remedy that so it doesn't happen again?
Yeah, I think that was an incredibly difficult time. It seemed to be there was a letter went out from a GP practice in Wales, and then it felt as if that became pretty widespread as well. That I don't know whether there was an immediate reaction or whatever it was that happened there, but lots of people, I think lots of medical professionals felt, or possibly thinking we should have done this a while ago. Now, our guidance in Scotland on DNA CPRs or DNRs, depending on what acronym you use for it, is not changed. So we have always maintained that has not changed, and that should be done as part of, a gentle anticipatory care plan in a way that, respects and supports people's dignity and human rights. I know that we have had examples of where that's not happened. I know the Cabinet Secretary in Health has been very concerned about this, and so has the CMO's office. I suppose for the purposes of Alec Cole-Hamilton's question, he wants to know what we've done about it, and he's absolutely right to ask that. So immediately I had concerns straight away about the impact of people feeling as if they were being pressured or not understanding what a DNR is. All of those questions that come along with capacity and ability to make decisions, and whether someone would make that decision for you and you don't know about it. We've seen some, terrible examples of a form being slipped into somebody's bag, all of those things. So one of the immediate pieces of work that we did, there was an ethical guidance issued by the CMO's office very, very quickly on the back of that, because lots of people, and especially all of the stakeholder engagement I was having, especially DPOs and other organisations, are very, very concerned about this, feeling as if they were not being treated equally. So ethical guidance was issued very, very quickly on the back of this. On the back of that ethical guidance, again, so we had some feedback, because what we've attempted to do is every single stage of the work that we've done, we went back out to stakeholders to say, does this work? Does this answer the questions? Does this give you the support you need? Does this give you the reassurance, in this case, of what you need? So that's been back and forward, and we've got a group working with the CMO's office, including Sally Witcher from Inclusion, who you'll know doesn't mince her words in any of these things. So that there's an update updated ethical guidance coming out very, very soon, I believe, because it's went back and forward with stakeholders to get it absolutely right, which I felt was incredibly important, that we needed to get this right to reassure, maintain people's human rights, maintain human dignity, and not just scare the bejesus out of people, because that's exactly what it was doing. So if there's other information that you share that the committee's heard, please let me know, because we can feed that into the process that we currently have. Equalities and human rights officials working with the CMO's office and working with health officials and working most importantly with stakeholders like Sally and others. Hopefully we've got this right now as well.
Alex.
Thank you very much, Convener, and thank you very much, Minister, for that comprehensive answer. The final area I would like to look at is Section 9 of the Coronavirus Scotland Act. I challenged the Cabinet Secretary for the Constitution on whether we could repeal those more draconian aspects of the Act reflecting mental health legislation, particularly around the number of clinicians required to impose a detention order on somebody and the amount of time that somebody can be held. The Cabinet Secretary referenced correspondence from senior psychiatrists. Now, psychiatrists may have a different viewpoint, I think, than human rights practitioners. So can I ask, further to the committee's letter of the 4th of June 2020, has the Scottish Government had discussions with the UK Government about the repeal of Schedule 9? And if not, does the Scottish Government have a trigger for bringing into force Schedule 9 of the Coronavirus Act?
Minister.
You'll know that the emergency legislation has to be reviewed every 3 weeks in Scotland, and you'll know that there was some changes made at the Coronavirus Number 2 bill on certain aspects of this. I suppose that the Schedule 9 was always going to be a contentious issue, and you're absolutely right. It means very, very different things to human rights activists and maybe that it does to psychiatrists. And I suppose it was put in place at the time, and I know it was put in place at a time when we thought the health service would be completely overwhelmed with COVID cases, and it was to ensure that people got the right care when they needed it and as quickly as possible. We know sometimes that's not the best way to do this. We understand that, we realise that in working this up, but we did feel it was important to have that piece of legislation in there. On Schedule 9 in particular, we've not had to enact it. I don't know if we ever will need to enact it. And you know that the UK Government's legislation is reviewed every 6 months as well. So there is work being done right now to talk to the UK Government. So these points have been raised with the UK Government, and we're hoping, that they'll listen to the comments that we've got here. I know that maybe psychiatrists and their work is very differently viewed in the work that they have to do, and I think attempting to balance rights to make sure that people did get interventions and the right medical help or support needed in an emergency is always good to have that sort of a backstop, but it's always good to be able to review that, and we do have the opportunity to review that. So yes, we have had conversations with the UK Government on that, and I can make sure that once we have some feedback from that, which I don't think we have had yet, that I feed that back to the committee to make sure that you're completely up to date and what response we've had from the UK Government on that.
Alex.
Thank you. That's me, Convener. Thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Minister, I wonder if I could just on that matter, just press you a little bit on the trigger for enacting. That we heard from Social Work Scotland that there had been some pressure, they didn't give us specifics, but colleagues have been pressing for it to be enacted. So what would the trigger be for bringing it into force, please, Minister?
So I suppose that's a difficult question to answer, because I suspect it will be triggered on an individual case, and we would never know all the circumstances of why that case would be, the schedule would be used in that particular case. I also think that we don't know whether we will see a second wave, whether there will be another peak, whether we will need some of this legislation in place for that as well. I think my honest answer is that I don't think we know how and when it would be triggered in a sense of it being about an individual and what their needs are at the time, and the way that it would be used at the time as well. So I suppose keeping a very strong human rights based focus an eye on that if it is ever triggered, making sure that we've got the right monitoring and auditing of how it's used and when it's used.
I think we can probably leave that here for today, but I suspect the committee might want to follow up with the Scottish Government on that to get some more information on specifics. But moving on, if I can bring Pauline McNeilan, please. Pauline.
Is it on this subject of do not resuscitate, Ruth, or is it my questions?
If you could, I've got you down for questions around mental health and shielding, but the floor is yours, Pauline.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Minister. You'll only be too aware about the pressures on mental health. Many members have raised it, and obviously, like most services, there's a backlog of cases. I just wondered if you could tell the committee what your thoughts are in relation to dealing with the backlog, and if there's going to be any additional resources available to mental health services.
Minister.
You may know that officials across lots of parts of government have been working very closely with health boards and wider stakeholders, obviously to support mental health staff to maintain the integrity and the quality of services across Scotland. That's been difficult to do that, and they've looked at all sorts of innovative ways to do that as well. And also looking forward to this time of recovery and when now we're lifting lockdown, what's going to emerge and how can we be ready to provide a service to do that. You'll know that we issued a set of principles on, I think, the 1st of May to guide the delivery of mental health services around referral processes, managing existing waiting times, and crucially, on the 14th of May, the government wrote to all NHS boards highlighting mental health as a clinical priority, setting out many plans for recovery and requirements for mental health within the coronavirus mobilisation plans. We look to boards to reflect this priority within the resourcing. And on resourcing, you'll know that we've had a very high profile and I think successful Clear Your Head marketing campaign, where we invested around, I think, £6 million in initiatives to support mental health over recent weeks, including £2.6 million to increase the capacity of NHS 24's telephone and online services, and £1.2 million to extend the availability of digital therapies, including a £1 million to roll out the distress intervention on a national basis. And I think you'll agree that the DBI piece of work there is something that I think is incredibly important as we do emerge and our people have developed some issues. 3 months in lockdown, the social harm of that is huge. Another piece of work that I've been working very closely with stakeholders across with health colleagues as well as on social isolation and loneliness. So we've developed many resources and scenarios and worked with lots of organisations in order to ensure that there was a suite of services and a choice of services there, maybe not the traditional way that people would have mental health interventions, but maybe in other ways. And actually, a couple of young people that I know locally in my constituency who access some of the online stuff that we did through Young Scot have felt that was much more effective than maybe some of the other traditional interventions that they had before. So there's something to learn here about how we can use other ways to connect with people in a setting maybe that they find more comfortable rather than a clinical setting as well. So we're looking at all of that as part of our social renewal work too.
Pauline.
Thank you very much. Could I ask you a question following on from what Alec Cole-Hamilton asked you about the do not resuscitate notices and the whole controversy around over 65s, because it's clearly in your portfolio. I know what you said about the guidance, but I just wondered have you investigated where this came from? Because not only is there concern around the do not resuscitate notices, but I mean, many GPs have said that early on in the lockdown, they were specifically told not to send over 65s to hospital. Now that changed. So, I mean, have you spoke to the Chief Medical Officer, for example? I mean, where did this come from in the first place?
Minister.
I think the honest answer, Pauline, is that we don't know, to be honest, because our guidance didn't change. Our guidance to GPs and other health professionals didn't change. I think there was a bit of a panic at the beginning, thinking the health service would be overwhelmed. I suspect, as I said to Alex Cole-Hamilton, that a number of GPs maybe were thinking, to get this, we need to make sure that people don't understand this or don't understand it, or whatever it was. The honest answer is we don't know where this emerged from. It came along with the virus as part of a lot of the concerns that came up on the over 65s specifically. So I've got a fantastic group of people called my Older People's Strategic Action Forum, who are an incredibly amazing group of very connected individuals in their communities, in their age demographic, and across many disciplines. And quite a few of them had anecdotal evidence of this. They knew somebody that this happened to, that they were just got a phone call for the GP's receptionist, or they got a letter dropped, or an email. There was a terrible case in Aberdeen where somebody got a text message. So it's incredibly difficult to work out where this came from, but we have been absolutely clear on this. The DNR guidance has not changed. The ethical guidance that came along with it, was a quick remedy to remind people to apply ethics and dignity and human rights to all of these decisions. That anticipatory care planning should be done in a sensitive, and co-produced manner, not in the manner in which we have seen some of the anecdotal evidence. And on the back of that, we've now worked with health professionals, the CMO's office in particular, and the Equality and Human Rights team, to develop ethical guidance that's even more clear. And we've done that alongside many of those stakeholders, as I said, including our amazing OPSAF group, who have been very vocal on some of the challenges that they saw. And that's why I've attempted to, incorporate all of that lived experience, all of that, understanding into the future work that we have continued now. And certainly as we emerge into recovery and into renewal, what have we learned? Because there must be a lesson to learn here about how a piece of information travels, in a viral fashion like that, and scares so many people when it didn't need to.
Thank you, Minister.
Just finally, convener. Yes, but Minister, what I'd like to hear is, are you going to make any inquiries as to where it came from? If you accept that it happened, there's direct discrimination against over 65s. Somewhere, somebody in the system, whether it's medical clinicians, I don't know, took a decision in the early days of lockdown not to admit over 65s into hospital. So surely ministers want to get to the bottom of how it happened in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. And the same question was asked of the Cabinet First Minister, Cabinet Secretary, yes, the First Minister, I think yesterday, and she's agreed that we need to look at that. So I'm happy to go back. We're already working with the CMO's office on this right now. So let me go back and find out exactly what investigations they did to find out where that came from. I think the First Minister made that commitment yesterday as well. So let me do that. Happy to do that.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you very much.
Angela.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning, Minister. I have two questions. My first question is a quick follow-up to the questions on mental health legislation, Schedule 9 in particular. And I just wonder if the Minister could say more on this. On the one hand, the government has consistently said that the emergency powers won't be in a moment longer than they're required. From a human rights perspective, how does that then fit with we need to keep these powers on the books just in case of a second wave?
Minister.
I suppose it's that question of how do we keep the balance right? How do we maintain a public health response that is, the fundamental right, the right to life, and keeping people safe, and have the powers and the measures to do that, whilst understanding that it's a pretty blunt instrument to use in supporting individuals as well, and getting that balance just right. So I suppose the just in case, as Angela Constance will know, has always been a practice in social work for many years, as having your backstops just in case. That doesn't then take away for the point that this is a pretty blunt and fearsome piece of legislation if you are the individual that's been caught up in it. And how do we get that right? And the work that's been done to attempt to balance the rights of the individual with the public health response that we need to have to keep people safe and keep people alive has been one of the most difficult balances to strike in government. The emergency legislation where this is contained has a human rights report attached to every time that we have a review. So every time the review comes up, we go back again and say, do we still need this? Do we still need this? And the balance is that, yes, we do right now. We still need this right now. Hopefully, and I am really hopeful, I heard some news this morning of a possible vaccine, which I think just fill us all with hope that, something will emerge soon that will take away all of these concerns that we have, and how to manage, a second wave or another peak, or, maybe a sectoral issue that emerges. How do we do that better? I'm hoping we'll never need to use this piece of legislation. I suppose in my heart, I'm thinking, did we, for someone from a human rights point of view, and looking at that, it's always a bit, it's a bit rough, I think, as I say, a bit of a blunt instrument. But you can then see if the medical profession is overwhelmed, where they would need some of that quick response time as well. So it's just getting the balance right, and it's really difficult. It's been one of the hardest pieces of work we've had to work on.
Angela.
Okay, thanks for that, Minister. Convener, I'm very conscious that you've still got a few other members to come in, so I'll try and be brief. My next question is around social care packages, and the Minister will be very interested to know about the evidence that we heard from Alliance and other organisations who spoke about with the issues around increasing the eligibility criteria for packages, which in some cases has resulted in reduced or no support. So given that the Scottish Government wants to make independent living a reality for disabled people in Scotland and have a lead role in the Fairer Scotland for Disabled People Action Plan, what steps will be taken to ensure that disabled people get the right support at the right time?
Minister.
Yeah, no, I think it's an incredibly important question as well, and one that all of the stakeholders that I've been meeting with have raised with me at almost every meeting. Some local authorities ended up in some really dire straits quite quickly. I think Glasgow had about a 30% absence rate from its social care workforce, and they were able to recruit some more people to try and balance that up. And the consequence of that was care packages were reduced, or in some cases withdrawn. Not something that we supported at government level at all. We think that some of the disproportionate impact on people, especially people who have got maybe complex disabilities, who need access to daycare, families who need access to respite, families who want to visit their parent or elderly relative in a care home. All of these things have been incredibly difficult. But when it comes to care packages, families, especially home carers, have been left with the burden of some of this. So it's been very difficult to get some of this sorted out. However, there has been additional monies given to local authorities in order to maintain care packages. We expect, and we have said this, and we're working closely with COSLA, we expect any limitation or reduction in care packages to return to normal as soon as possible. We know many local authorities are already working towards that aim. including looking at how do they provide respite, how do they provide daycare, how do they provide the support for families who have maybe been in lockdown, many of them with the person they're caring for shielding, so some of the additional consequences of that as well. But we do expect local authorities to get those care packages back up and running as quickly as possible, and we don't expect, big massive reviews on that either, because I think that would just add to the stress and worry that many carers and families have experienced over the past 3 months.
Angela, are you content?
I'm content, Convener. I know time's short.
Yeah. If I can bring in Fulton McGregor now, please. Fulton.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister. I suppose one of the most worrying issues that over the lockdown, particularly during the strict period of the lockdown, was about the exposure of many women and children in Scotland to further domestic violence. And I know this is something that you yourself are very passionate about, Minister, and the committee certainly took a lot of evidence on it during this. What supports the Scottish Government have put in place for women and children who may be experiencing domestic abuse and violence, and perhaps talk a wee bit about what support local authorities have received specifically to provide housing for families in this situation.
Minister.
Yeah, I think the very first stakeholder meeting I had, I think on the day after lockdown, was with the violence against women sector, because I realised, and I think many of us realised very, very quickly, that if you're in an abusive, coercive, violent relationship, and we're telling you to stay in your house for 3 months, how incredibly difficult that would be. One of the first things that we did was to ensure that the coronavirus legislation allowed for someone to flee. So that was one of the very first things that we ensured was there. We took very clear understanding from our main stakeholders, who were Women's Aid and Rape Crisis, who expected a massive influx both from their digital and their helpline platforms, because women would not be able to access the services in a traditional way. So the First Minister, within I think a week or two, announced an additional package of money of £1.35 million to Women's Aid, and that was to increase capacity of their helpline, to get some new kit, to enable much more extensive use of their digital and online services as well, to basically reprioritise a number of the pieces of work that they wanted to do, and that cut across all of our violence against women organisations and the work that they needed to do. We talked to other organisations like supermarkets and pharmacies, a number of other pieces of work, along with our colleagues in England and Wales and Ireland too, to look at how do we get a message, how do we use things like the back. Morrison's used the back of the receipts now, the National Helpline is on that. Tesco's had banners up in their shops with the National Helpline contact details, because we realised that actually the supermarket, that visit for the shopping once a week, was maybe the only point of freedom that someone would have in order to attempt to access a service. So we try to think, of all of the most innovative and basic ways that someone could get access to those services, and we funded that appropriately. COSLA and the Improvement Service, we published guidance to local authorities, which basically signpost to local resources to assist all the decision makers in identifying women and children at risk. That was a big bit of work as well, so that we knew what the short, medium and long term steps that would need to be taken for both protecting people within the pandemic, for recovery, and then the well-being for us coming out of that. We still anticipate that when, in the next few weeks as lockdown's lifted, that those services will be inundated, and we're planning for some of that work and speaking almost on a weekly basis, I think, with our stakeholders. We ensured that our domestic abuse and forced marriage helpline is open to anyone experiencing domestic abuse, and all of the ways that we attempted to find ways to make sure that people had access to that. The national leaflet that went out had the national helpline on that, as well as and amongst the helpful numbers. On housing, I mentioned earlier about the fact that we ensured that one of the coronavirus exemptions was to allow people to flee if they needed to do that. We've worked very, very closely with COSLA and others to ensure that councils could open voids, they could move people in that sense. So Scottish Women's Aid, with the Chartered Institute of Housing, published their guidance for social landlords, which was incredibly helpful. We supported that piece of work, just to ensure that they did have, the opportunities if someone needed to flee, that they had somewhere safe to go to. One of the challenges was that refugees, because of social distancing, had to go from maybe being multi-family units to single family units, so the capacity there was already reduced. So allowing that bit of freedom for local authorities and housing social landlords to address that was really helpful. I'm trying to do a quick response because I know that we're quickly running out of time, but there's been a huge piece of work. I can give the committee a further update on that. We did a piece of work on no recourse to public funds as well, working with Shakti and Hemant Greif and others like that, because we could do no recourse to public funds, which is an absolute aberration, as we know, but because it was a public health emergency, there was things that we could do using the public health emergency to support people in those situations as well.
Thank you, Minister, for that very full answer. Fulton, do you feel that's covered the points you were wanting raised? It was certainly comprehensive.
Yeah, it was. It was really just a quick follow-up, convener, on that as well. And I think that you're right. There has been a lot of work done in this area. I know that hindsight's a wonderful thing, but I wonder, with the possibility of a wave happening, if there's anything that could be done around May specifically, as it was very obvious in the earlies of lockdown that the public were taking a very active role. I don't think any MSP's inboxes wouldn't have been full with information about what other people were maybe doing, were they out in the street, were they out at parks, and they shouldn't be there. And councils and police authorities were reacting appropriately to that. But one of the things that dawned on me, and I'm sure every other MSP here, was that we don't know the circumstances of people, and were some of these people actually getting out of the way of an extremely abusive situation, and all their safety nets have been taken away. So is there anything that the government are thinking about how we could have messaging around that if there's ever a need to impose such restrictions again, which hopefully we won't, of course?
No, it's a really important question, and part of the work that we've done in government, we have a public services hub. There's a number of hubs, an economy one, there's a health one, and there's a public services hub chaired by the Deputy First Minister, which includes me and Shirley-Ann Somerville, Aileen Campbell and Kevin Stewart, Hamza Yusuf and Ash Denham, Marie Todd and Richard Lockhead. So you can see the breadth of public services there. But in all of those meetings, there's a justice update every day. And at the very beginning of this, there was a very, very collegiate approach across government to look at domestic violence and some of the challenges within that. And one was the justice response. And what response would you give to people, who were fleeing? So police already had an understanding of all of this work, so that if you did, I suspect because of I think we've had about 14,000 police officers now trained in our new legislation, that if someone said, I needed to just get out the house because, that's what's happening there, I've not seen anything come through in any of that work to suggest that the police took a heavy hand with anyone on that aspect. More so, probably they were able to signpost them to the right services and the right support. But it's a good question to think about as we emerge, and one that's not lost on all of us who are thinking about how we go into renewal and make sure that we can address some of this much more effectively, especially on test and protect, if people have to periodically go back into isolation because maybe they've been in contact with someone with the virus, and how do we manage that more effectively and give a more tailored response. But something I'll think about, definitely.
Thank you, Minister. And if I can bring in Alison Harris now, please. Alison.
Morning, Minister. Thank you, Convener. As you'll be aware, obviously, Minister, that the Scottish Government has set up two expert groups. The expert group to look at the impact on minority ethnic communities, and the Advisory Board on Social Renewal, which I think I heard you mention earlier. But I would like to ask you, Minister, if you have any information about the membership of these two groups, and if I could have further information on what these two groups will actually be doing, please.
Minister.
Yes, no, thanks very much, Alison. This the expert reference group on COVID and ethnicity meets for the second time right after this committee, and I'll be attending that meeting too. I attended the first one. They have developed a couple of key areas of work which you will not be surprised to hear. There's 5 targeted pieces of work, so I'll give you that, and then I can give you the membership too. So number 1 is understanding the data, which is something we've spoken about this morning already. So we have analysts in the Scottish Government, Public Health Scotland, National Records of Scotland, and they're all carrying out further work on the data to review what we have, create a clearer picture of the impact of COVID on minority ethnic communities in Scotland. We know that the data that we currently have tells us there's not much of a difference here, but we're heavily caveating that with the data is not complete, so that's why that piece of work needs to be done. The other thing was about workplace assessments, and it was about protecting frontline workers who are in our Black and Asian minority ethnic communities, and we have implemented interim national guidance on that right now, so that risk assessments are done and reviewed appropriately, along with the member of staff, to make sure that they're fully protected and allowed to continue to do their job as well. The third piece of work is we did a targeted marketing campaign, especially through Ramadan, to get those messages out in a format that, in a language that people understood, but to target straight into some of our minority ethnic communities as well. So that was using, other media platforms, bespoke radio stations, all of that stuff as well. Number 4 was direct engagement, which is again that what I've said is most of my work over the last 3 months is to sit down with stakeholders to say what's happening, how's it happening, what can we do to redress it, what ideas have you got to help, to work together. So we're continuing that piece of work, and that will continue. And we have also created, as you know, the COVID and ethnicity reference group, who I'm meeting later today. Now, the membership of that group, which is I think maybe almost complete, but maybe not complete, because I think we may bring in some expertise as we go along. But I can give you a quick rundown of who they are. Emma Jackson, who you will know has given evidence to the committee. Vital Katacredi, who is a Senior Clinical Research Fellow at the University of Glasgow and a consultant in public health. Douglas Anderson is a senior actuary specialising in longevity and diversity, because that's obviously we want to have that. Raj Gopal is Emeritus Professor of Public Health at the University of Edinburgh. Jatin Haria is from CRER, as you'll know, and we have Rami Usta from BEMIS, because we felt it was important to have stakeholder voices in there. Aisha Holloway is the Head of Nursing Studies at the Edinburgh University. Kalyani Lyle, who is our former Race Equality Framework Advisor. Nasser Mir is a Professor of Race, Identity and Citizenship at the School of Social Political Sciences at Edinburgh University. Gina Netto, who is a reader in the School of Built Environment, Heriot-Watt University, specialising in ethnicity and social justice. I think you'll see we have a pretty broad range of both academic, health professionals, in that, and we have a number of Scottish Government advisors and officials in there as well, including our data experts. So that's that one. The Social Renewal Advisory Board, who I think met for the first time last week, has a much longer membership list, and I think for time constraints, Convener, I can maybe send you on that list if that's helpful, because it's a longer list. But the people in there like Angela O'Hagan, Anna Fowley, Bill Scott, Councillor Alison Evison, Eileen Colley from the Scottish Pensioners Forum, a number of people in there, and that group will be looking at doing a bit of a set up like the National Advisory Council on Women and Girls. So they'll have an advisory board and they'll have individual circles which will focus on specific topics, and some of those topics that are emerging already are food security and access to food, housing, and all the things that come along with that. And one of the ones that I'll be, myself and Shirley-Anne Somerville will be involved in, is a circle on age and disability. So that's cutting across all of those intersections to ensure that we target in and all of that. As I say, social security, older people, communities and local government portfolios, housing experts, disability, poverty and homelessness experts, and a third sector are all involved in that. But the list is pretty extensive, Convener, so I'll maybe get officials to send it over to you so that you know exactly who's on that.
Thank you, Minister. We appreciate that. Alison, do you have another question you wish to ask?
Yes. Well, basically, you know, the committee has heard about progress that has been made in addressing the pandemic, such as flexible working practices and how that's benefited, for example, some disabled people and groups, and also about progress in dealing with homelessness. So can I just ask, how do you think this could be sustained after the pandemic, Minister?
Minister.
Yeah, a big part of the work of the advisory board on renewal on the work that Shirley-Ann and Aileen are doing is looking at that. So there's been some amazing pieces of work done. The Ethnic Minority Resilience Network have fed hundreds and hundreds of people with culturally appropriate food over this period with a small bit of money. They got a bit of money, they disseminated that out to their local networks, and they've just provided an amazing service. The Gypsy Traveller work that we've done has actually really increased good working relationships right across the board, including with local authorities and other agencies. So when I was speaking to them last week, they're like, how can we sustain that relationship? So it's not just about funding sustainability, it's about the relationship and the mechanisms that's being used. Working from home now, there's no one now who can ever say that a reasonable adjustment to a workplace by allowing a member of staff to work from home is not achievable. We all know now that it is. So looking at what we do as far as the flexible working fund, we have a flexible working fund in the Scottish Government, you know, looking at how we can use that much more effectively, look at some of the learning that we have had, looking at, you know, how do we tackle homelessness? We've managed to basically lift everyone who was rough sleeping. How do we sustain that and maintain that? Kevin Stewart's working very, very closely on that, because the last thing he wants to see is those people going back to the streets. So I know that he's re-established the SRAB, which is an acronym, and it's on my wee notes here, but I know it's the John Sparks piece of work on you know, how to, you know, end homelessness, and how they've developed all of that. So we've drawn on all of that experience, all of that understanding, the tiny bits of money that made transformational change. How do we ensure that we can maintain that going forward? For my purposes in my portfolio, the funding rounds that we had were coming to an end now at the end of June. So I've managed to extend one of those funds with a new fund coming into play in autumn now. And I managed to extend the other fund right through to 2021, because all of those organisations, the last thing they needed was to go into a new application round, a new procurement round, and whilst they're in the front of all of this too. So I'm looking now at all of that funding and how do we, you know, use that much more effectively and target into the things that really matter. But I think we've learned a lot of lessons. We know who the essential workers are in the world now. We know how we need to support them, and we know how amazingly communities can respond when you give them a wee bit of support and a wee bit of money, and they just get on and do it because they have been absolutely fabulous.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. And on that note, we conclude our evidence session and the public part of this morning's meeting. I thank the Minister and our officials very much for their attendance today. We'll follow up with any scrutiny issues by correspondence, and those will be published on our website. Now, our inquiry is still open for responses, and I would encourage people and organisations to let us know how the easing of lockdown restrictions is affecting them and what their views are on equalities and human rights and the recovery plan for Scotland. The next meeting of the committee will be scheduled for when the Parliament returns in August, and we will now move into private session for consideration of items 2 and 3 on Microsoft Teams. Thank you.